The doors opened, and the entire room went silent. Not because someone died, but because someone walked in. Frank Lucas, not crying, not praying, carrying 100,000 in cash. At Bumpy Johnson's funeral, in that moment, every mobster in Harlem realized the truth. The king was gone. 3. And a new one was bold enough to announce himself. The rain came down slow and heavy, like Harlem itself was trying to wash away a memory it couldn't afford to forget. Black umbrellas lined the sidewalk outside the funeral home, crowding the street with men who rarely stood this close unless business demanded it. Tonight wasn't business. Tonight was fear. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson was dead, and the streets could feel it. The kind of silence that follows a gunshot hung in the air, thick and uneasy, pressing against every chest that walked through those doors. Inside, the lights were low, dim enough to blur faces, but bright enough to recognize danger. Men who had survived decades of street wars stood stiff in their suits, hands folded, eyes restless. These were men who had ordered killings with a nod, men who never flinched at screams or sirens. Yet here they were, whispering like schoolboys, glancing over shoulders, measuring each breath. When a king dies, nobody relaxes. They calculate. Bumpy lay at the front of the room, calm in death in a way he rarely allowed in life. The sharp eyes that once scared grown men into silence were closed forever. The hands that had signed death warrants and peace deals alike were folded neatly. 3. Harlem's king didn't look dangerous anymore, but everyone knew better. His shadow still filled the room. 3. You could almost hear his voice, low and steady, reminding them that power doesn't vanish, it waits. Italian mobsters stood along the walls, pretending to mourn. Some had done business with Bumpy. Others had tried to kill him and failed. Tonight, those differences didn't matter. Respect demanded their presence. Absence would have been noticed, remembered, punished later. In the underworld, funerals are audits. Everyone watches who shows up and who doesn't. Harlem soldiers mixed with numbers runners, bookmakers, hustlers. 3. And men who claimed to be businessmen but smelled like gun oil and blood. Old enemies shared the same row of chairs. Old friends avoided eye contact. Every man in that room knew the same truth. Bumpy Johnson was the glue. Without him, the streets would crack. 3. Outside, the rain soaked into a lone figure standing across the street. 3. Frank Lucas watched the funeral home from under the brim of his hat, water dripping down his coat. He wasn't inside yet. Not because he was late, but because timing mattered. Frank had spent years being invisible, learning when to speak and when silence was stronger. Tonight, silence would scream. A black car pulled up, then another. Each arrival tightened the air inside. The room filled, but nobody sat comfortably. No one laughed. No one told stories. The usual fake warmth of funerals was missing. This wasn't about grief. It was about what came next. Bumpy's empire was now an open table, and every man there was counting chairs. Some whispered that Harlem would burn. Others believed the Italians would take over completely. A few thought the streets would fracture into chaos, blood spilling into gutters like rainwater. Nobody said these things out loud. Saying them made them feel real, and reality was dangerous enough. Bumpy's body rested in the casket, but his presence hovered above every head. The man had survived prison, assassins, betrayals, and wars. He had negotiated with men who wore suits worth more than houses and killers who didn't wear faces at all. 3. He had balanced brutality with protection, fear with loyalty. Harlem had lived under his rules for so long that nobody remembered what life was like without them. That was the real terror. Not that Bumpy was gone, but that his rules were gone with him. The front doors creaked open again, and a few heads turned instinctively. Every sound felt louder now. Every movement drew eyes. Even the smallest disruption could signal a shift. Somewhere. A man cleared his throat, and another tightened his jaw. Outside, Frank Lucas finally stepped forward, rain trailing behind him like a warning. In his hands was a bag, heavy enough to pull at his arms, heavy enough to bend the future. He paused at the entrance, listening to the quiet inside. He knew what waited for him beyond those doors, men who would kill him without blinking, if given a reason. Frank exhaled slowly. Bumpy Johnson was gone. 3. And Harlem was about to find out who was brave enough to walk into the silence he left behind. Frank Lucas stood just outside the funeral home. Rain sliding off the brim of his hat and dripping onto the concrete like a ticking clock. From the street, he could see the shadows moving behind the frosted glass. 3. Silhouettes of men who had lived their entire lives by violence and secrets. Every one of them was dangerous. Every one of them was watching. Frank didn't rush. He had learned from Bumpy that hesitation could be fatal, but so could moving too fast. For years, Frank had been invisible. He had opened doors, driven cars, waited outside restaurants, memorized faces without being noticed. While others talked, he listened. While others bragged, he learned. Bumpy Johnson never wasted words on fools, but when he spoke to Frank, he spoke carefully. He taught him how power really worked, how respect was earned in silence long before it was demanded out loud. Those lessons echoed now, louder than the rain. Frank adjusted his grip on the bag. It was heavier than it looked. Not just because of the money inside, but because of what that money represented. This wasn't charity. This wasn't grief. This was a statement, and statements in Harlem were written in blood. 3. He knew that the moment he crossed that threshold, there would be no turning back. He would either walk out a different man or not walk out at all. The doors opened slowly, releasing a hush so deep it swallowed the sound of the rain. Conversations died instantly. Heads turned. Eyes locked onto Frank like gun barrels. Some recognized him right away, Bumpy's driver, the quiet one. Others squinted, trying to place the face. A driver wasn't supposed to matter. That's what made the moment dangerous. Frank stepped inside. The air felt thick. heavy with suspicion and unspoken threats. The smell of flowers mixed with cologne and old smoke. 53. He could feel the weight of every stare pressing against his back as he took his first step forward. No one moved to greet him. No one blocked his path. They simply watched, measuring him, deciding whether he was bold or stupid. With each step, Frank felt the room tighten. Italian captains leaned slightly forward, eyes narrowed. Harlem soldiers shifted their feet, hands instinctively close to their coats. Somewhere near the back, a man's jaw clenched hard enough to crack teeth. Frank kept his gaze steady. He didn't look left. He didn't look right. Looking was weakness. Walking was power. He thought of the nights spent driving Bumpy through Harlem, listening as the city whispered past the windows. The warnings, the stories of men who tried to rise too fast and ended up forgotten in alleys. Bumpy had survived because he understood timing. Frank understood it too. This moment wasn't about speed. 3. It was about nerve. The bag swung slightly at his side as he moved closer to the front. The sound of his shoes against the floor echoed louder than it should have. Tap. Pause. Tap. Each step felt like a question asked of the room. No one answered. Silence followed him like a shadow. As he neared the casket, the tension became almost unbearable. This was sacred ground. Even enemies respected a man in death, especially a man like Bumpy Johnson. To cross this space required more than courage. It required permission that only the bold dared to take. Frank stopped in front of the casket. Bumpy lay still, his face calm, untouched by the storms he had lived through. Frank stared at him for a long second. Not in grief, not in fear, but in acknowledgement. Everything Frank was about to become traced back to the man lying there. Without Bumpy, he would still be a nobody. Because of Bumpy, he knew exactly what had to be done. Slowly, deliberately, Frank bent down. He placed the bag beside the casket. A faint rustle came from the cash inside as it settled. That sound hit the room like a gunshot. Eyes widened. Breaths caught. Men who had survived shootouts felt their hearts skip. They all understood now. This wasn't a driver paying respects. This was a man stepping out of the shadows. Frank straightened up. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The silence was no longer mourning. It was recognition. Some faces hardened with anger. Others flickered with reluctant respect. A few men exchanged glances, already calculating what this meant for the future. Frank turned slowly. 3. Feeling the full weight of the room on his back. Every step away from the casket was a test. Would someone stop him? Would a gun come out? Would this be the end of his story? He walked. 3. And when he reached the doors, without a single hand touching him, Frank Lucas knew something had changed forever. The money sat beside the casket like a live wire, buzzing with meaning no one dared to touch. $100,000 in cash wasn't just wealth in that room. It was language. Every man there spoke it fluently, and every man understood exactly what had been said. Funerals in Harlem weren't only about the dead. They were about the living, 53. About who still had the strength to stand when the ground shifted beneath their feet. Whispers moved through the room like smoke, thin but impossible to ignore. Some men leaned closer to each other, lips barely moving, eyes fixed on the bag as if it might explode. Others stared straight ahead, pretending indifference. Pretend their tightened shoulders told a different story. No one reached for the money. Touching it would mean acknowledging the challenge, and nobody was ready to do that yet. The Italians noticed everything. They had been raised on signs and signals, on knowing when a man was bluffing and when he was deadly serious. This wasn't bluff. This was raw confidence. 3. A driver didn't bring that kind of cash unless he had something backing him. 3. The question wasn't whether Frank Lucas had courage. The question was where that courage came from and who stood behind him. Harlem soldiers felt the sting more sharply. Some of them had bled for Bumpy, enforced his rules, taken bullets meant for him. They believed loyalty should have counted for more. Seeing Frank step forward, like that felt like betrayal. 3. Like someone skipping the line in a world where lines were enforced with fists and guns. A few hands trembled near coat pockets. Anger mixed with temptation in dangerous ways. 3. One wrong move could have shattered everything. Killing Frank in that room would have been easy. A single pull of the trigger, and the problem would disappear. But murder at Bumpy Johnson's funeral wasn't just killing a man. It was an announcement of war. Harlem wasn't ready for that kind of firestorm, and the Italians certainly weren't eager to watch the city explode. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, daring someone to break it. Frank stood near the door, calm on the surface, pulse steady in his ears. He knew exactly what was happening behind him. He could feel the calculations being made, the risks being weighed. This was the moment where men decided whether to act or wait. And waiting, in the underworld, was often the smarter move. Someone coughed softly. Another man shifted his weight. Small sounds, but they signaled surrender to reality. No one was going to challenge Frank here. Not today. The room had decided to live another day, even if it meant swallowing pride. Frank took a breath and stepped outside. The rain hit his face like cold truth. He didn't look back. Looking back would suggest doubt, and doubt was a scent predators could smell. Behind him, the funeral resumed its quiet rhythm, but nothing felt the same anymore. The bag of money remained, a marker planted in sacred ground. Outside, the whispers grew louder. That driver's got nerve. He just made a move. Bumpy taught him well. Frank heard none of it, but he felt it. 3. The city felt different now, like it was watching him instead of ignoring him. The streets had always been hungry, but now they were curious. Curiosity was dangerous. Curiosity led to challenges. Within hours, the message spread through Harlem's bars, back rooms, and phone lines. Frank Lucas had stepped forward. Not loudly, not violently, but clearly. Some laughed it off, calling it disrespect. saying he wouldn't last a month. Others grew cautious. Men who survive long enough learn to respect boldness when they see it. Late that night, small meetings took place in quiet apartments and smoke-filled rooms. Names were mentioned. Possibilities discussed. Some talked about cutting Frank out early, before he grew roots. Others suggested watching him, letting him reveal his hand. Nobody agreed. Division crept in, just as Bumpy's absence had allowed. Frank knew this part was coming. He had expected the tension, the plotting, the invisible lines being redrawn. Bumpy had warned him that stepping into power meant living with a target on your back. But power also meant people hesitated before pulling the trigger. And hesitation was time. Time was opportunity. That 100,000 wasn't gone. It was working. It had bought him something more valuable than protection. It had bought him recognition. From that moment on, Frank Lucas wasn't just Bumpy's driver anymore. 3. He was a factor. And in Harlem, being a factor meant everything was about to test you. The question wasn't whether someone would come for him. The question was who would be first, and whether they'd live long enough to try again. After the funeral, Harlem didn't explode the way many expected. It shifted, quietly, subtly. Like a loaded gun being moved from one hand to another. The streets kept breathing, but the rhythm was off. Conversations stopped when Frank Lucas walked by. Eyes followed him longer than before. He wasn't king yet. But he wasn't invisible either, and in Harlem, that was the most dangerous place to stand. Frank didn't rush to claim anything. That was the mistake most men made. They tried to fill the silence too quickly, and the streets punished them for it. Frank moved slow, deliberate, letting others reveal themselves. He listened more than he spoke, just like Bumpy had taught him. Every rumor, every whisper reached his ears sooner or later. Harlem talked, and Frank paid attention. The old power structure was cracking. Without Bumpy, small crews tried to expand, pushing boundaries they once feared. Frank watched them burn themselves out, fighting over corners and numbers, rotes that barely paid. While they spilled blood in the open, Frank worked in the shadows, building something cleaner and stronger. Violence brought attention. Attention brought death. Frank wanted neither. He focused on supply. 3. Bumpy had always said the man who controls the source controls the street. Frank took that lesson and sharpened it. Instead of relying on the Italians, instead of begging for access, Frank looked beyond them. He followed the chain back to its beginning, cutting out every greedy hand that had been taking a slice for decades. When his product finally hit Harlem, people noticed immediately. It was cleaner, stronger, cheaper. Dealers who had struggled suddenly made money again. Money built loyalty faster than fear ever could. Frank paid on time, protected his people, and didn't tolerate betrayal. His rules were simple, and because they were simple, they were followed. The Italians watched closely. At first, they laughed. Then they worried. Then they got angry. Frank Lucas was doing something no one thought possible, outplaying them without declaring war. He didn't insult them. He didn't challenge them publicly. He simply made them less necessary. That was the real threat. Attempts were made, quiet ones. A deal that smelled wrong. A warning passed through a third party. A car that followed too long at night. Frank survived them all because he expected them. Bumpy had prepared him for this phase. The part where success makes enemies braver and friends nervous. Frank trusted no one completely, not even the men closest to him. As the months passed, Harlem adjusted. New routines formed. New loyalties settled in. Frank's name carried weight now, not because he demanded respect, but because he delivered results. The streets don't care about legends. They care about consistency. Frank was consistent. Looking back, people would say it all started at the funeral. That was the day Frank Lucas stopped being a background figure and became a possibility. The 100,000 wasn't just money, it was proof of intent. Everything that followed grew from that moment of silence, when no one dared to stop him. But power never stops asking for payment. 3. Every decision Frank made pulled him deeper into the role he had chosen. There was no stepping back into the shadows. Every success raised the stakes. Every rival waited for a mistake. Frank understood this better than anyone. He had watched Bumpy carry that weight for years, seen the toll it took. Power aged a man faster than time. Late at night, 3. Frank sometimes thought about that walk down the aisle, the eyes on him, the silence pressing in. That was the last moment of pure choice. After that, the path was set. He had chosen to stand when others hesitated. Harlem had answered by watching. Years later, when people spoke Frank Lucas's name with a mix of fear and admiration, few remembered the rain or the quiet or the bag of cash beside a casket. But that was where it began. One man, one decision, one room too silent to forget. And somewhere deep in Harlem's memory, a question still lingered. Whispered in bars and back rooms long after the players were gone. What if someone had pulled the trigger that day? Because sometimes history survives not because of what happened, but because of what didn't.